Welcome to the deep dive. We are really thrilled to have you with us today because we are tackling a story that it has absolutely consumed the national conversation.
Oh, completely. It's dominating everywhere. Headlines, dinner table arguments, legal blogs, everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. We are embarking on a really comprehensive examination of the Luigi Mangione case. And for those of you who might just be catching up or maybe you've only seen the really sensationalized sound bites on social media, Mangione is the man accused of the December 2024 fatal shooting of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson in Midtown Manhattan.
And it's a case that has touched on almost every raw nerve in American society, really. To truly understand it, you have to look past those initial breathless news reports. You have to dig into the mechanical gears of our justice system, the underlying psychology of the public, and,
The pop culture aspect, too.
right, the frankly bizarre ways that modern culture processes tragedy. I mean, this isn't just a true crime story. It's a mirror reflecting some very uncomfortable realities about where we are right now as a society.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to do that, to really look in that mirror, we have gathered a truly massive, very eclectic stack of source materials for you today. We are looking at official trial transcripts from a suppression hearing in Pennsylvania, drawn from a highly detailed jurist dispatch.
We also have federal court opinions straight from the Southern District of New York.
Right, and state court rulings detailed by MSNOW. Plus, we're digging into some fascinating and honestly deeply unsettling public opinion polling from Cloud Research.
We've pulled a local YouTube news report breaking down the highly technical mechanics of the murder weapon, too.
Oh, the ghost gun stuff. Yeah, and excerpts from the suspect's own manifesto, hosted on Scribd, and believe it or not, a Wikipedia page detailing a satirical stage musical that was somehow spawned by this entire event.
It is a total labyrinth of legal, cultural, and forensic information. Our mission today is to synthesize all of this for you. We are going to guide you through the hyper-technical legal rulings that actually removed the federal death penalty from the table and the incredibly granular, almost cinematic details of how the arrest went down.
Not to mention the shockingly sympathetic public reaction and that surreal pop culture fallout. We want to make all of this digestible, clear, and memorable for you. But before we go any further, before we open up this massive stack of sources, we have a mandatory and extremely important disclaimer for you.
Yes, very important. We need to be explicitly clear that the sources we are discussing today contain highly charged political rhetoric.
Highly charged.
They contain overt justifications for extreme violence, and they feature extreme viewpoints originating from both the far left and the far right sides of the political spectrum.
That is absolutely correct. We want to make it unequivocally clear to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the contents of the suspect's manifesto in any way, nor are we validating or endorsing the political opinions expressed by the individuals in the public polling data we're going to share.
Exactly. We're simply here to impartially report on the contents of the provided source material. We are treating this as a factual record of what happened, what was said, and how the public reacted.
Our goal is understanding, not endorsement. So with all of that clearly on the table, where do we actually begin a story that has so many tangled threads? I mean, where is the starting line here?
I think we have to begin with the climax of the manhunt, really, because the circumstances of the arrest set the stage for the massive legal battles we're seeing right now. We'll have to look at that jurist dispatch covering the suppression hearing in New York State Court.
Okay, yeah.
This hearing was devoted entirely to the testimony of a single witness, an Altoona, Pennsylvania police officer named Joseph Detweiler.
Let's set the scene for you on this. It's December 9, 2024. 5 days have passed since Brian Thompson was shot in broad daylight in Manhattan. The entire country is watching this massive coordinated manhunt. The NYPD, the FBI, literally everyone is looking for this guy. And where does the trail end?
Not in some sophisticated safe house.
No, not a private jet on a tarmac either. It ends in an Altoona, Pennsylvania McDonald's, roughly 230 miles west of Manhattan. Just the geography alone is fascinating. He made it out of the city, across New Jersey, and deep into central Pennsylvania.
The contrast of the setting is really what stands out when you read the transcripts. The atmosphere in that New York courtroom during the suppression hearing was incredibly tense.
Yeah, the dispatch paints this vivid picture of the 13th floor courtroom. It was packed. You had high-profile reporters like Lorena O'Neill, who wrote that major Rolling Stone piece on Mangione, huddled together, literally fighting over the only functional power outlet in the room to charge their laptops, typing furiously as the testimony unfolded.
And right there in the middle of it all is Mangione himself. The dispatch describes him sitting there in a black suit with a light gray checked button-down shirt. He is completely stoic.
Not fidgeting at all.
No, he's not looking around anxiously. He's just resting his arm on the back of his chair, watching the officer who arrested him recount the story. Officer Detweiler is on the stand, methodically walking the court through his body camera footage from that morning.
He testified that he was working a standard 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. patrol shift. Around 9 a.m., the Blair County 911 Center dispatched officers to that specific McDonald's because an employee had called in a report of a suspicious male in the dining room who matched the photos of the New York City shooter.
Photos that the dispatch notes Fox News had just blasted out. Detweiler testified he had actually been watching a lot of Fox News during his downtime and had seen the NYPD Crime Stoppers images.
You know the ones. The grainy surveillance stills of a man with a gun in a knapsack, the footage from the hostel, the guy sitting in the back of a cab with a medical mask pulled up over his face. But what's really incredible is Detweiler's mindset heading into the call. He didn't actually believe it was going to be the fugitive.
Right, he testified under oath that he was being semi-sarcastic when he took the call. He thought it was just another false alarm, which is super common in high-profile cases like this. People call in tips for everything.
Yeah, he even joked with his lieutenant over text. His lieutenant texted him, saying that if Detweiler actually caught the Manhattan shooter, he'd buy him a hoagie from a local Altoona sandwich shop called Luigi's.
The irony of the name Luigi's is just...
You can't write that. It's too perfect. So Detweiler and his partner, Officer Fry, pull up to the McDonald's. They walk into the dining area, and the body cam audio captures the surreal, almost cinematic nature of the scene. Mangione was seated at a table near the restrooms in the back of the restaurant.
He's wearing a tan beanie, a blue medical mask covering his face, and this very thick, puffy coat.
And in the background, playing faintly over the fast food restaurant speakers, are classical Christmas songs. You can literally hear Jingle Bell Rock and Have a Holly Jolly Christmas playing. It's the ultimate juxtaposition. A nationwide manhunt culminating over a fast food breakfast while holiday music echoes in the background.
Detweiler walks up to the table. According to the transcript, he says, "Someone called and thought you were suspicious. Can you pull the mask down?" Mangione doesn't hesitate or panic. He just says, "Yeah, sure," and lowers the blue medical mask.
And Detweiler testified that the absolute second that mask came down, he knew. He said he knew immediately, 100%, that he was looking at the most wanted man in America. But he plays it completely cool.
He doesn't draw his weapon. He doesn't scream. He just calmly asks for an ID.
Mangione reaches into his belongings and hands over a fake New Jersey driver's license bearing the name Mark Rosario.
At this point, Detweiler engages him in small talk, trying to keep the situation de-escalated. He falsely tells Mangione that there's a McDonald's policy against sitting in the restaurant for too long, just giving a mundane excuse for the police interaction.
And Mangione's reaction is chillingly calm. He just continues eating his meal. He finishes a hash brown and then moves on to a steak sandwich, taking bites while talking to the officers. Eating a steak sandwich while the police are surrounding you, knowing what's in your backpack, it speaks to a highly regulated nervous system.
Eventually, Detweiler asks him to stand up and place his hands on his head. Mangione ignores the command the first time. He ignores it the second time. But eventually, he complies, standing up and putting his hands behind his head.
Detweiler immediately conducts a Terry stop pat-down search. As he testified, he was certain this was the shooter, and he knew the murder weapon had not been recovered in New York. He is patting him down, looking for a firearm.
But he finds no gun on Mangione's person, largely due to the thick layers of that puffy coat he was wearing. So Detweiler pivots and seizes Mangione's backpack.
And right there, that split-second decision to grab the backpack is the entire crux of the suppression hearing, detailed in the jurist dispatch. Mangione's defense attorney, Karen Friedman Agnifilo, is fighting tooth and nail, arguing that seizing and searching that backpack without a warrant was a direct violation of Mangione's Fourth Amendment rights.
The defense's argument is very technical, but very important. Agnifilo argued that Detweiler and Fry had strategically positioned themselves to block Mangione's exit path from the booth.
By standing in the aisle.
Right. By doing so, they had effectively detained him, placing him in police custody without formally arresting him and without reading him his Miranda rights first. The defense pointed out a crucial piece of body cam audio where another officer on the scene, Corporal Trent, can actually be heard saying, "We'll need a search warrant."
Wait, so let me wrap my head around this. The defense is saying because he wasn't free to leave, the interrogation and the subsequent search of the bag were illegal. If they win this argument, does all the evidence in the backpack get thrown out?
That is the goal of a suppression hearing, yes. If evidence is deemed fruit of the poisonous tree, meaning it was obtained through an unconstitutional search, it cannot be used at trial. However, the prosecution is likely relying on a legal concept called the doctrine of inevitable discovery, along with exigent circumstances.
Meaning they would have found it anyway.
Exactly. They will argue that the officers had an immediate, pressing safety concern to search a bag belonging to a suspected armed assassin in a public restaurant, and that even if they had waited for a warrant, they would have legally found the evidence regardless.
And what they found in that backpack is the absolute foundation of the state's physical case. They open the bag and find $7,000 in U.S. cash, predominantly in crisp $100 bills. But they also find an assortment of foreign currency kept in a blue and white tropical design pouch.
The inventory lists 20 and 100 Thai baht notes, a 500 Indian rupee note, and 1,000 Japanese yen. They also cataloged a jar of Skippy peanut butter, some rolled-up string, and, crucially, a firearm.
The presence of the foreign currency is a detail that investigators have heavily scrutinized. I mean, when you have a suspect with thousands in U.S. cash and specific Asian currencies, baht, rupees, yen, it strongly suggests a premeditated escape plan that extended far beyond the borders of the United States. It implies an intent to vanish entirely.
But the cash is secondary to what else was in the bag. It wasn't just a standard handgun, it was a ghost gun. Heavily modified, capable of firing 9mm rounds, and equipped with a 3D printed silencer.
And the ammunition inside the weapon was marked with a very specific, chilling message. Written directly on the bullets were the words delay, deny, and depose.
What's fascinating here is the highly technical nature of that weapon, which points directly to the sophistication of the suspect. If we look at the transcript from the WMAR2 News YouTube report out of Maryland, they interviewed a Pasadena gun shop owner named Frank Loan.
He provided a masterclass on what a ghost gun actually is.
He really did. He explained that these weapons are entirely untraceable because they lack serial numbers. The frames, which are often made of polymer plastic, are sold perfectly legally online. They're sold as 80% receivers.
So what exactly is an 80% receiver? I hear that term thrown around in the news all the time, but the WMAR2 report really breaks down the physical reality of it.
In the firearms industry, an 80% receiver is basically an unfinished block of metal or plastic. It's the core frame of the gun, but it hasn't been machined enough to be legally classified as a firearm by the ATF.
Because it's technically just a piece of plastic.
Right. And because of that, anyone can buy it online without a background check. The buyer then takes it home, uses a drill press or a specialized jig, and finishes the remaining 20% of the manufacturing process themselves, drilling the specific holes for the trigger assembly and the safety.
Once the frame is finished, they simply order the remaining parts online, the slide, the barrel, the firing pin, and assemble a fully functional, completely untraceable weapon. Frank Loan, the gun shop owner, mentioned he actually obtained some of these 3D printed receivers after helping clean out a customer's home when their spouse died.
But he refuses to sell them.
Right. He says he wants absolutely nothing to do with them because they exist entirely outside the regulated market. But the real standout detail from that WMAR2 report isn't just the ghost gun itself, it's the silencer. Loan noted that while 3D printed receivers are becoming increasingly common, a 3D printed silencer or suppressor is incredibly rare.
He specifically stated he had never seen one before in his shop, and there's a good reason for that. You can't just print a solid tube of plastic and expect it to muffle a gunshot.
It would just blow up.
Exactly. A suppressor requires highly specialized machines and a deep understanding of acoustics, gas expansion, and pressure baffles. When a 9mm round is fired, the expanding gases create immense pressure. A poorly designed 3D printed plastic silencer will literally just explode in the user's hand.
To print one that actually works and survives the pressure of multiple shots requires a tremendous amount of technical skill, precise measurements, and high-quality materials.
Which perfectly aligns with the profile of the suspect. You have a 27-year-old graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, coming from a wealthy Maryland family, possessing the resources and the education to understand computer-aided design.
And then you have the ammunition. The specific words written on the rounds, delay, deny, and depose, are not random. They mimic a well-known phrase used by critics and patient advocacy groups to describe the ruthless tactics that major insurance companies allegedly use to avoid paying out legitimate patient claims.
They delay the paperwork, they deny the coverage, and they depose the patients in legal battles until the patient gives up or dies.
Which brings us to the core question of motive. How does a young man with a privileged background end up in an Altoona McDonald's with a highly engineered, untraceable weapon accused of assassinating a major CEO? The answer to that lies in the manifesto found in his possession, and it leads directly into the truly shocking public reaction that followed the shooting.
So we have the manifesto excerpts, which were hosted online on Scribd. They provide a direct, unfiltered window into the suspect's stated rationale. The document is titled Luigi Mangione Manifesto Overview, and what's striking is how clinical and detached the tone is.
He explicitly addresses federal investigators right off the bat, writing, "To the feds, I'll keep this short because I do respect what you do for our country. To save you a lengthy investigation, I state plainly that I wasn't working with anyone."
He is immediately establishing a lone wolf narrative. He goes on to describe the assassination itself not as a complex tactical operation, but as fairly trivial. He attributes his success to some elementary social engineering, basic CAD, a lot of patience.
This directly links back to the WMAR2 report. CAD refers to computer-aided design software. He is openly confirming that he used his technical education to design and manufacture the untraceable weapon parts. The manifesto continues with a bizarre, almost polite apology for any strife or traumas he caused.
But then the tone shifts dramatically.
Yeah, he states, and I quote,
Mhm.
"Frankly, these parasites simply had it coming." He then lays out a heavily statistical argument to justify the violence. He notes that the United States has the #1 most expensive healthcare system in the world by a massive margin, yet the country ranks roughly 42nd globally in life expectancy.
He targets United Healthcare specifically, pointing out that it is one of the largest companies in the United States by market capitalization, trailing only tech monopolies like Apple and Google and retail behemoths like Walmart.
His argument is that they have achieved this wealth not by providing a superior product, but through systemic exploitation.
He writes that executives continue to abuse our country for immense profit because the American public has allowed them to get away with it. He concludes this section with a chilling flourish, saying, "Evidently, I'm the first to face it with such brutal honesty."
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the release of these motivations, this framing of a murder as an act of violent, anti-corporate populism, struck a very specific, very raw nerve in the American public. And we aren't just guessing about the public mood here.
No, we have concrete empirical data to show exactly how deep that reaction went, thanks to a comprehensive polling study conducted by Cloud Research and published on their blog by Dr. Zahn Rosen on December 23, 2024.
The data in this Cloud Research poll is, quite frankly, staggering. The survey asked respondents directly about their feelings toward Mangione and his actions. The results show that nearly 25% of the respondents, 1 in 4 Americans surveyed, felt at least somewhat sympathetic toward the accused shooter.
But the findings go far beyond mere sympathy.
This is the part that genuinely made me pause when I was reviewing the sources. When the researchers asked if the respondents supported the actual murder of Brian Thompson, 11% of participants said they were either supportive or very supportive.
And another 32% said they were at least a little bit supportive.
That means over 40% of the people surveyed found some level of justification for a premeditated assassination on a city street. Those are unprecedented numbers for a crime of this nature.
Usually, a high-profile murder unites the public in condemnation. But here, the demographics of the support reveal deep societal fractures. The Cloud Research data, which was carefully weighted to match U.S. population proportions, showed that support and sympathy were heavily skewed toward younger demographics.
Specifically, those under 30 and those identifying politically as liberal showed the highest rates of support. For instance, 42% of people under the age of 30 expressed sympathy for Mangione. Compare that to the 65 and older crowd, where sympathy was almost zero.
Among those who identified as liberal, 48% expressed a moderate amount or a lot of sympathy. And a full 25%, 1/4 of self-identified liberals, were supportive or very supportive of the murder itself.
But Dr. Rosen's thematic analysis of the poll responses revealed something even more complex. While the statistical peak was among young liberals, the underlying anger wasn't confined to just one demographic.
Not at all. Frustration with the American healthcare system crossed party lines, age brackets, and racial demographics. People from vastly different backgrounds cited crippling medical debt, routinely denied coverage, and a pervasive feeling that the system is fundamentally broken and designed purely to extract profit at the expense of human life.
To really understand this, we need to look at the specific in-depth voter interviews that Cloud Research conducted. These qualitative quotes bring the raw data to life. And again, to you, the listener, we must reiterate our impartiality disclaimer here. The views expressed by these survey respondents are intense, they are extreme, and they explicitly justify violence. We are reading them to you verbatim from the source material to illustrate the factual reality of the public's psychological response. We are not endorsing these views in any way.
Precisely. We are acting as a mirror to the data, and the data shows a deeply fractured public. Take, for example, the 31-year-old Asian man who was interviewed by Cloud Research.
He stated, and I quote, "He's quite literally fighting for people like me, and that's a good thing. I haven't cheered for someone like this since Bernie Sanders was running for president. Eat the rich, as the kids say."
This respondent views Mangione not as a criminal suspect, but as a proxy fighter against a system he feels personally oppressed by. The connection to a mainstream political figure like Bernie Sanders shows how revolutionary political rhetoric can mutate into support for vigilantism.
Then there's the interview with a 44-year-old white woman, a registered Democrat. She told the interviewers that her initial reaction to the news wasn't horror. It was surprise that a CEO of a health insurance company didn't have a massive private security detail.
She explicitly said she wasn't surprised he was targeted.
She explained her personal history, noting she had lived in Canada for 15 years, where she received health care at no cost at the point of service. When she moved back to the United States, her daughter was unexpectedly hospitalized for appendicitis.
And she details the financial devastation of that event. Even with what she considered good health insurance, she owed $20,000 out of pocket plus her deductible because the insurance company simply refused to cover various billed items from the hospital.
Her quote in the survey is damning. She said, "The health insurance companies have the blood of thousands, if not millions of Americans on their hands." She rated her sympathy for Mangione a perfect 5 out of 5, noting that her own daily struggles with chronic back pain and navigating the system to get treatment gave her a visceral, deep understanding of his motivations.
When asked if she supported the murder, she rated it a 4 out of 5. Her justification was, violence is the only way to get them to listen.
And to demonstrate how this anger bridges the ideological divide, look at the response from a 29-year-old white man, a registered Republican. His initial reaction was, "Good riddance to the CEO, and Luigi is a hero of the common folk."
Here is a conservative voter utilizing the language of class warfare. He stated that healthcare in America is a scam run by greedy corporations at the expense of human life, arguing it should never be for profit.
He expressed a 5 out of 5 for sympathy and a 5 out of 5 for supporting the murder, stating unequivocally, revolutionary changes can only come about from violence and revolt. You also had a 47-year-old Democrat woman who felt a moderate amount of sympathy, citing her own constant, low-level terror of financial devastation if anyone in her family had a major health issue.
She was only a little bit supportive of the murder itself, noting that it's difficult to actively support taking a human life, but she added that she felt fear and desperation can blur the lines of right and wrong for ordinary people.
And finally, a 28-year-old Latina who identified as an independent voter. She told researchers that the incident felt like an act of justice. She cited hypothetical, yet incredibly common, examples of an ambulance ride being denied coverage because a patient could technically have driven themselves to the hospital while having a heart attack.
She said the insurance industry just feels like a business designed to extract more money, devoid of any humanity.
So what does Dr. Rosen conclude from all this in his analysis? He points out how historically rare it is for a crime like this to generate this specific type of public reaction. Over half the participants in the poll felt the system is entirely too driven by profit.
Almost a third called it outright exploitative, and nearly 13% felt it lacks any fundamental empathy. This public polling highlights a profound sociological phenomenon, often referred to as the horseshoe theory, where the extreme left and the extreme right converge.
A significant chunk of the American population was willing to bypass the deep-seated moral taboo of murder. Why? Because they viewed the victim not as an individual man, but as an avatar, a symbol of corporate greed.
And they viewed the accused not as an assassin, but as a martyr, someone who sacrificed a life of immense privilege and education to send a violent message on behalf of the working class.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I mean, that is a terrifying prospect for anyone sitting in a C-suite right now. The public might have had this visceral, deeply emotional reaction to the case, analyzing it through the lens of social justice, personal grievance, or anti-corporate vigilantism. But the legal system doesn't care about public polls.
Not at all. The legal system operates on cold, hard text. It operates on statutes, definitions, and precedents.
So how did the courts actually handle the charges against Mangione? Let's turn to the state case first and the highly publicized dropping of the terrorism charges.
For the details on this, we are looking at an article from MSNOW's Deadline Legal blog, written by Jordan Rubin and published on September 16, 2025. The article details a major landscape-shifting ruling by New York State Justice Gregory Caro.
Following a series of defense motions, Justice Caro dismissed the two terrorism-related murder charges against Mangione, ruling that they were legally insufficient. This was a massive blow to Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg.
Huge blow.
In the days and weeks following the shooting, Bragg's office had clearly attempted to shape the narrative of this crime in the media and in the courtroom as a definitive act of domestic terrorism. They wanted to send a message that you cannot assassinate corporate leaders to effect political change.
But Mangione's defense team successfully argued against that specific legal classification. So how does the defense win that argument? Why did the judge side with them and throw out the terrorism enhancement?
It all comes down to the precise, inflexible legal definition of terrorism under New York state law. To prove a terrorism charge in New York, state prosecutors cannot simply show that a horrific act of violence occurred that scared people. They must prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant had a specific intent to intimidate or coerce a civilian population.
A civilian population. Those three words are the entire battlefield.
Exactly. Justice Caro looked at the facts of the case, the manifesto, the evidence, and the text of the statute. And he ruled that the employees of a single company, even a massive multi-billion-dollar multinational corporation like United Healthcare, do not constitute a civilian population within the meaning of the terrorism law.
That is such a fascinating, hyper-specific distinction. You can terrify a boardroom. You can strike fear into the hearts of a specific corporate roster or even an entire industry sector. But legally, you cannot call it terrorism against a civilian population unless it is aimed at the general public.
Furthermore, Justice Caro had to analyze Mangione's specific intent based on the evidence presented, primarily the manifesto. The court found that based on the suspect's own words, his conscious objective was to draw public attention to what he perceived as the greed of the insurance industry.
A secondary objective, as he noted in his writings, was to negatively affect the financial standing and stock price of the company.
He literally wanted to tank their market cap.
Right. And the judge explicitly wrote in his ruling that while the district attorney presented sufficient evidence to argue that Mangione murdered Brian Thompson in a premeditated and calculated execution, that action does not legally equate to doing so with terroristic intent as defined by the legislature.
A calculated assassination to make a point about stock prices and insurance policies is murder, but it is not terrorism under the strict textual reading of New York law. So, Bragg loses the terrorism angle because a corporation isn't a civilian population. It's a qualified win for Mangione's defense team in the state court. The terrorism charges are gone.
But the MSNBW article makes it very clear he is not off the hook. He isn't walking free. The state trial is officially scheduled for June 8, 2026, and Mangione still faces a straightforward top-count charge of intentional murder.
In New York, that carries a maximum penalty of 25 years to life in prison, and that's a crucial point. New York State abolished the death penalty years ago. The maximum risk Mangione faces from Alvin Bragg's office is life behind bars. But the federal system is an entirely different beast.
The federal system does have the death penalty, and the threat of federal execution was looming massive over the separate federal case proceeding in tandem with the state case. However, the legal maneuverings in the federal court are perhaps the most complex, counterintuitive, and surprising aspect of this entire story.
Which brings us to the federal case, the mind-bending legal doctrine known as the categorical approach and the fight over the death penalty. While the state case was boiled down to a straightforward murder charge, the federal case is where the real legal fireworks happened.
We're looking at an article from KSL.com published on February 27, 2026. The headline alone tells a massive story. Federal prosecutors won't appeal ruling barring death penalty in Luigi Mangione case.
This article outlines the aftermath of a monumental, highly technical 39-page opinion issued in January 2026 by Judge Margaret Garnett of the Southern District of New York. In that opinion, Judge Garnett dismissed the specific federal charges that would have enabled the Justice Department to seek capital punishment.
And in late February, Deputy U.S. Attorney Sean Buckley formally notified the court that the government would not appeal her decision to the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals.
This essentially cleared the way for the federal trial, which is now set to begin on September 8, 2026. The maximum penalty Mangione faces federally is now life in prison, the exact same as the state case. And this decision completely disrupted the plans of the incoming administration.
The KSL article notes the intense political pressure surrounding this. Attorney General Pam Bondi had publicly declared a strong desire to see Mangione executed. She went on television and called it a premeditated, cold-blooded assassination that shocked America.
It was widely reported that this was supposed to be the showcase, the first major capital case brought by the Justice Department in President Trump's second term. It was meant to send a hardline message about law and order.
Mangione's lawyers fought back aggressively against this narrative. They argued in court filings that the authorities had severely prejudiced his case by turning his arrest and extradition into what they called a Marvel movie spectacle.
I remember watching that on the news. They paraded him up a Manhattan pier, surrounded by a small army of heavily armed officers, helicopters overhead, while politicians loudly demanded the death penalty before a grand jury had even formally indicted him.
Mangione himself actually spoke out against facing two separate trials for the exact same crime, telling a judge during a hearing, 1 + 1 is 2, double jeopardy by any common sense definition.
Legally, the dual sovereignty doctrine allows both the state and the federal government to try someone for the same act if it violates both state and federal laws. So it isn't double jeopardy in the eyes of the court.
But despite all of this immense political pressure, the media circus, and the Attorney General's demands, Judge Garnett followed the letter of the law. To understand why she threw out the death penalty-eligible charges, we have to dive deep into her 39-page written opinion, which we have in full in our source stack.
It is an absolute masterclass in a highly technical, deeply controversial legal doctrine known as the categorical approach.
Okay, let's unpack this, because reading through this legal opinion, my head was spinning. It feels like you need a law degree just to read the table of contents.
The charges Judge Garnett dismissed were Count 3 and Count 4 of the federal indictment. Count 3 was brought under 18 U.S.C. 924J, which is murder through the use of a firearm. Count 4 was under 18 U.S.C. 924C, which is using a firearm equipped with a silencer.
Now, here's the catch. Most murders are charged at the state level, like we saw with Alvin Bragg in New York. The federal government only has jurisdiction to charge a murder if it fits into specific statutory boxes. Those firearm and murder charges, 924C and 924J, can only be brought federally if they happen during and in relation to another specific federal crime.
And that underlying foundational crime must legally qualify as a crime of violence, which creates a massive jurisdictional puzzle. Here, the federal government tried to use two federal stalking laws as the underlying foundational crimes to trigger the firearm and murder charges. Specifically, Count 1 was interstate stalking and Count 2 was cyber stalking, both falling under the statute 18 U.S.C. 2261A.
So the million-dollar question, or rather the life-or-death question for Judge Garnett, was this. Are interstate stalking and cyber stalking legally defined as crimes of violence? If they are, the foundation holds, the murder charges stick, and the death penalty stays on the table.
If they aren't, the foundation crumbles, the murder charges are dismissed, and the death penalty goes away.
Exactly. And to figure out the answer to that question, Judge Garnett was legally bound by Supreme Court precedent to use the categorical approach.
So how does that actually work in practice? Because reading her explanation of it, it sounds incredibly counterintuitive.
It is deeply counterintuitive. In fact, even Judge Garnett acknowledged in her written opinion that the result of this approach might strike the average citizen as tortured and strained and contrary to our intuitions about the criminal law. The categorical approach requires a judge to completely and totally ignore the actual facts of the case in front of them.
Wait, so let me wrap my head around this. If I'm understanding the categorical approach, Judge Garnett isn't allowed to look at the security footage. She has to pretend she doesn't know how Brian Thompson actually died. She has to ignore the fact that Mangione allegedly walked up to a man on a public street and shot him in the back with a silenced 9mm handgun.
That is exactly right. Under Supreme Court precedent, specifically a landmark case called Taylor v. United States, the judge is legally forbidden from looking at the defendant's actual conduct. The judge must look only at the text of the underlying statute, in this case, the stalking statute.
The categorical approach asks one single rigid question. Does the statutory definition of this crime always, in every conceivable instance, require the government to prove the use, attempted use, or threatened use of physical force?
Always. That word seems to be the linchpin of the entire argument.
Yes. The judge essentially has to play a high-stakes game of hypotheticals. They must identify the absolute minimum criminal conduct necessary to be convicted under that specific statute. If the judge can imagine even one plausible, non-fanciful scenario where someone could commit the crime of federal stalking without intentionally using physical force, then stalking is categorically not a crime of violence.
And if it's not a crime of violence, the heavy federal firearm and murder charges attached to it collapse entirely.
This brings in the concept of mens rea, or the state of mind of the perpetrator. The opinion cites another major Supreme Court case, Borden v. United States, which ruled that to qualify as a use of physical force, the action must be done with a mental state greater than recklessness. Negligence or recklessness isn't enough. It has to be a knowing or intentional act of force.
Right. In Borden, the Supreme Court established that the phrase use of physical force against the person of another demands that the perpetrator consciously and willfully direct their violent action at a target. Reckless conduct, where you merely disregard a substantial risk of harm but don't intend it, does not meet the threshold for a crime of violence under federal definitions.
So Judge Garnett analyzes the federal stalking statute, 18 U.S.C. 2261A, using what she calls the modified categorical approach. She notes the statute is heavily divisible into different types of crimes. You have travel stalking and you have cyber stalking. Those are further divided into causing reasonable fear or causing emotional distress.
The government charged Mangione with the reasonable fear elements, plus a severe penalty enhancement because death resulted from the stalking. So the judge has to look at the text and ask, does traveling across state lines or using the internet to place someone in reasonable fear of death, with death ultimately resulting, always require the intentional use of physical force?
And Judge Garnett, after 39 pages of grueling legal analysis, concludes the answer is no. She finds what we might call the stalking loophole. The federal stalking statute requires that the perpetrator acts with the intent to harass or intimidate.
But crucially, the statute does not require the perpetrator to subjectively intend to place the victim in fear of death, nor does it require the perpetrator to intentionally use physical force to cause that fear. The element of placing the victim in reasonable fear can be accomplished purely through reckless behavior.
To make this abstract legal concept concrete for you, Judge Garnett actually outlines specific, incredibly detailed hypotheticals in her opinion to prove her point. I want to read the first one, which we can call the car crash scenario. She poses a situation where a man travels across state lines to harass an ex-lover.
His only intent is to humiliate her, maybe post some embarrassing signs at her workplace. He has absolutely no intention of being violent.
He sends an anonymous creepy text saying, "We need to talk," and parks outside her house. The victim, already terrified by the ongoing harassment, sees his car, panics, and speeds away in her own vehicle. The stalker, wanting his confrontation, recklessly follows her through town.
The victim, terrified and looking in her rearview mirror, makes a sudden turn. The stalker loses control of his car because he was driving recklessly and crashes into her, tragically killing her.
In that hypothetical scenario, every single element of the federal stalking statute is met. He traveled with the intent to harass. His course of conduct placed her in reasonable fear of death or serious injury. And as a direct result of that conduct, she died.
But, and this is the vital legal distinction that saves Mangione from the death penalty, at no point in that scenario did the stalker intentionally use physical force against her. The fear and the resulting death were the product of recklessness, not an intentional strike.
Because this hypothetical conviction is possible under the text of the statute does not categorically require the use of force. Therefore, it's legally not a crime of violence. That is just wild to wrap your head around. So essentially, the Supreme Court has built a system where the bloodier and more calculated the actual crime, the less the judge is allowed to look at it.
The law isn't a mirror of reality. It's a closed-loop math problem based on grammar. But she doesn't stop there. She offers a second hypothetical, the self-harm scenario. The stalking statute explicitly says the victim can be placed in reasonable fear for the death of themselves or for an immediate family member or spouse.
So Judge Garnett's reasons, a husband could travel across state lines with the intent to harass his estranged wife. To emotionally manipulate her, he threatens to shoot himself if she doesn't come out and talk to him.
And that scenario completely satisfies the text of the statute. He traveled with intent to harass, and he placed her in reasonable fear for the death of an immediate family member, namely himself. If the wife then tries to wrestle the gun away from him to save his life, and it accidentally goes off and kills her, the death results element is met too.
But again, threatening to harm oneself is not the use of physical force against another person. It fails the definition of a crime of violence. What's fascinating here is how this intricate legal puzzle completely upends the public narrative.
Hmm.
You have the Attorney General on national television calling it a cold-blooded assassination, demanding the ultimate punishment.
You have the public deeply divided over whether he's a villain or a folk hero. But in the quiet of the judge's chambers, none of that noise matters. The judge's hands are entirely tied by Supreme Court precedent that forces her to imagine reckless car crashes and suicidal husbands.
Because of those abstract hypotheticals, the death penalty is off the table for a man accused of walking up to someone and shooting them point blank. Judge Garnett wrote a very poignant line at the end of her opinion. The law must be the court's only concern.
It is a stark, almost brutal reminder of how the mechanical application of statutory interpretation can yield results that feel entirely disconnected from the bloody reality of the alleged crime.
But while the courts are bogged down in these complex hypotheticals, battling over the categorical approach and statutory text, the public has taken the story into an entirely different, almost surreal direction. We've talked about the legal system, we've talked about the public polling, but we haven't talked about how internet culture metabolizes a moment like this.
If you thought the legal arguments were strange, wait until you hear about Luigi the Musical.
Yes. According to the Wikipedia page we have in our source stack, Luigi the Musical is a satirical comedy musical that premiered in June 2025 at the Taylor Street Theater in San Francisco. It was written by two playwrights, Ariel Johnson and Nova Bradford.
The origin story of this production is as modern as it gets. Bradford actually conceived the initial idea during an open mic night at the SF Eagle, a well-known, historic gay bar in San Francisco's Soma district. She pitched the concept to her co-writer and a local producer named Caleb Zerang, and they immediately went into production.
We just spent 20 minutes talking about Supreme Court precedents and the death penalty, and now we have to talk about a tap-dancing Sam Bankman-Fried. The whiplash here is real, and the speed of this production is incredible. The shooting happens in December 2024, and by June 2025, there's a fully staged, fully choreographed musical playing in San Francisco.
The plot centers around the highly fictionalized, absurd experiences of Mangione while he is incarcerated awaiting trial at the Metropolitan Detention Center, or MDC, in Brooklyn. But he's not alone in his cell.
He's sharing the stage with two other real-life, incredibly high-profile inmates who were actually housed at MDC during that time. The disgraced crypto-billionaire Sam Bankman-Fried, known as SBF, and the music mogul Sean Diddy Combs.
The decision to group those three specific men together is a brilliant piece of sociological satire. Why those three? Because they represent three entirely different, massive failures of American capitalism and culture. SBF represents the utter collapse of the tech bro, venture capital, cryptocurrency illusion.
Diddy represents the unchecked, horrific abuse of power and exploitation in the entertainment industry. And Mangione, in the eyes of the playwrights, represents the violent vigilantism resulting from the collapse of the American healthcare system. Putting them in one room forces the audience to confront the rot at the core of these different institutions.
And the production clearly struck a massive chord, perhaps tapping into the exact same cultural nerve identified in that cloud research polling we discussed earlier. The initial 5-show run at the Taylor Street Theater sold out weeks in advance.
The hype was so intense they had to move the production to a much larger venue, the Independent, where they repeatedly extended the run and sold out those shows as well. Eventually, the production secured a highly coveted 5-show run at the prestigious Edinburgh Fringe Festival in Scotland in August 2025.
It was funded partly by an Indiegogo campaign that offered backers early access to an original cast recording and a filmed high-definition stage production. To give you a sense of the tone and the sheer audacity of this show, let's look at the track list detailed on the Wikipedia page.
The opening number, performed by the entire company, is called The Cheapest Room in Brooklyn, which sets the scene of billionaires and alleged assassins sharing a bleak federal jail cell. SBF, who is played by actor Andre Margheriti, has a frantic solo called Bay Area Baby, reflecting his Silicon Valley origins, and another delusional ballad called I've Got It This Time.
Diddy, played by Janae Lucas, joins SBF for a cynical, upbeat duet called I Like Money. There's a show-stopping trio with all three inmates called Diddy Party, which I can only imagine is incredibly dark given the allegations against Combs.
And then you have Mangione, played by Johnny Stein. He has a song called All for a Smile, a bizarre duet with a prison guard called Keys to My Heart, and the climax of the show, a sprawling, intensely dramatic 6-part epic song called Dear Manifesto.
The critical reception of the musical perfectly mirrored the polarized public reaction to the crime itself. Reviewers were sharply, vehemently divided. Chris Peterson, writing for the Onstage blog, absolutely panned the show.
He called it a gross misstep in the name of camp. He argued passionately that it was simply too soon, noting that the criminal trial hadn't even started yet, a man was dead, and the victim's family hadn't had their day in court. He wrote a scathing line, "Sure, let's add a kick line and call it critique."
On the other side of the aisle, you had Josh Marcus reviewing the opening night for The Independent. He gave it glowing, effusive praise, comparing great biting satire to great delivery pizza. It should arrive right on time, nearly too hot to touch.
Jonah Price over at Wonder Dave called it a beautiful, queer, chaotic lightning rod, praising the show for capturing the chaotic, anxious energy of the current cultural moment, even if every single note wasn't perfectly polished.
There's also a brilliant pay piece of meta-theater involved here that tells you exactly who the creators are. Lily Janiak, a highly respected theater reviewer for the San Francisco Chronicle, wrote a terrible review of the show. She said it didn't justify the hype, the pacing was off, and it just isn't any good.
The creators, leaning fully into the chaotic satire of the project, actually took her bad review, wrote it into the script, and had characters mock it during future performances. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is truly wild to think about. How does a real-life tragedy, an assassination of a CEO on the streets of New York, a manhunt that terrified a city morph into a campy, sold-out musical featuring a singing Sam Bankman-Fried in mere months?
It speaks volumes about how modern society processes high-profile, politically charged trauma. We no longer just consume the evening news. We process societal frustration through the lens of internet culture, instant content creation, and deep irony.
The musical acts as a pressure valve for the very real grievances about healthcare and wealth inequality that the Cloud Research poll highlighted. When traditional avenues for justice or systemic change feel blocked or broken, society often turns to dark satire to metabolize its collective anxiety. It's a coping mechanism for a system that feels completely out of the public's control.
Okay, let's take a breath and look at where we've been on this deep dive today. We started with a freezing morning at an Altoona McDonald's where a nationwide manhunt ended quietly over a steak sandwich, a fake ID, and the tune of Jingle Bell Rock.
We looked inside a backpack that contained a highly sophisticated, untraceable 3D-printed ghost gun and ammunition, demanding that insurance companies stop delaying and denying care. We read a manifesto decrying the American healthcare system as parasitic, and then looked at cold, hard polling data showing a shocking percentage of Americans, nearly a quarter, sympathizing with, and even supporting, a point-blank assassination because they felt the same systemic crush of medical debt.
We then navigated the absolute labyrinth of the legal system. We saw state terrorism charges dropped because, legally speaking, corporate employees aren't a civilian population. We waded through the dense, frustrating logic of the federal categorical approach, learning how a judge legally declared that an alleged assassination is not a crime of violence because the stalking statute could theoretically be violated by a reckless car crash or a suicidal husband.
That loophole alone removed the federal death penalty from the board. And finally, we ended up in a San Francisco theater watching a satirical musical about the suspect bunking with Sean Combs and Sam Bankman-Fried, highlighting how quickly tragedy is commodified into content. The stakes here moving forward are incredibly high.
As we head toward the state trial in June 2026 and the federal trial in September 2026, the intersection of law, politics, and public spectacle is only going to intensify. Mangione's defense is fighting the evidence from that McDonald's backpack, fighting the charges, and fighting the narrative.
And the government is fighting to secure convictions under incredibly complex statutes while navigating a public that is, in part, treating the defendant as a Robin Hood figure. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about the categorical approach or a poll from Cloud Research? Because this case shows you exactly how fragile the lines are between criminal justice, corporate accountability, and public spectacle. It shows how a single act of violence can fracture into a million different cultural and legal debates.
It forces us to ask deeply uncomfortable questions about our institutions. We have to look at the healthcare system that generated such intense cross-partisan public anger that citizens were willing to excuse murder. And we have to look at a legal system that relies on abstract, bizarre hypotheticals rather than the bloody reality of a crime scene to determine if someone faces the death penalty.
And we want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. Something that wasn't explicitly in the legal briefs or the polling data, but is the undeniable undercurrent of this entire saga. As corporate executives across the country, not just in healthcare, but in tech, in finance, and housing, watch this case unfold, they are seeing a suspect avoid the death penalty on a hyper-technical legal loophole. At the exact same time, they are seeing that same suspect cheered on by a quarter of surveyed Americans and immortalized as a protagonist in sold-out stage plays. How will this fundamentally alter the architecture of corporate America? We might be entering an era where the C-suite has to rethink not just their physical security details and their travel routes, but whether the court of public opinion still believes they are entitled to the basic status of a victim. Think about that the next time you interact with a massive, faceless corporation. Thanks for diving deep with us.